effort and higher RPEs produced less than half the progress for Chad. He had one block where we gained almost 8% over the block, and another one where we were only 3.7%. So today we're going to walk you through what those numbers actually mean for a lifter who's trying to peak for a powerlifting meet, and why this pattern of trying harder and getting less results is more common than a lot of lifters realize. Today we're going to be going through exactly how to find your sweet spot for programming and looking at the notes and data that you already have in your training logs to get that without getting overwhelmed by having analysis paralysis from looking at 10,000 different numbers that you could track but might not really impact your gains or the weight on the bar. How's it going, Zach?
Good, Nope.
Yeah, it's solid. So you had a really good analogy when we were talking about planning out this episode around, data review and planning blocks out and sort of your philosophy around this as a coach. Can you walk me through, how you look at this data collection process?
Yeah, and I think that this is like low-key ripped off of the from a Mike Tuchscherer comment about like a pen light in a cave, but there's a maze you're going through, you're mapping it out as you get through it. It'll be much easier to get through it the second time around, or if someone has that map to get through it, versus when you go through it initially, you got to make some turns that are going to lead you nowhere, you're going to hit some dead ends, and then you have to figure out, how do I piece this together to get to the other end of it?
Yeah, I think the analogy is like that, and then there was that additional layer, and that like we're human beings and we're evolving and changing, and so like that cave is always changing shape, and like the turns on the maze are always moving around on you a little bit, so it always gets more complicated. But I think one of the things that's tough with this is that there's no certainty. It's not like you're going to have one training cycle and you're like, I found it. This is it. This is the fast track to the 1,000-pound squat. Instead, it just gives you like a direction to go, and you can kind of stack the odds in your favor, but you're never going to be at 100%, right? And so how I see this tend to come up, where lifters will get stuck in this, we'll say late intermediate, lifetime intermediate phase, is, early in your lifting career, your first 3-4 years of lifting, pretty much like effort and consistency are going to drive 99% of your progress, right? You can typically hack 10 pounds on a PR by just improving your form, because it improves your efficiency without even getting stronger. And then the rest you can kind of take care of by just getting stronger and showing up and, applying that same stimulus. But at a certain point, your ability to produce force and produce fatigue is going to outpace your ability to recover from that with that weekly model, more or less, plus 5 pounds a week over the course of a block. And so it'll stop working at a certain point. And so your capacity to draw from the well and your capacity to refill the well and adapt over time it falls out of balance, right? And so we'll see, if we look at, from a data standpoint, your projected max, off of your best set of 5 at a 9 RPE, or your top single for the day, starts to flatten out, or it gets a lot more volatile, but the trend line through becomes a lot more flat. And in the context of competing, we'll also see this where this meet day performances get really unpredictable. Like the block is going great, and then the rug gets swept out from under you. When you're looking at a lifter in that situation, Zach, somebody comes in, they've signed up for coaching, and they've just run into a plateau for 6 months, right? Things were going great up to that point, and then that one block just stopped working, and they haven't been able to get past it. What are some of the first places you look, and also what are some of the common things you see in terms of behaviors that keep people stuck as well?
So I think behavior is probably a good place to start with it, because especially when we're looking at intermediates, there's this very wide gap between the people who will do everything, right? Well, where they'll come in, they've plateaued for 6 months, but their sleep is they're on top of their sleep, they're on top of their nutrition. They could tell you everything they eat for the past 2 weeks, and they're managing their stress super well. And at that point, it does just boil down to a programming technique type of issue. Versus like the other side is, yes, there's obviously intermediates who are coming in who they are not sleeping well, they're all over the place with their nutrition, they're getting like a third of their daily calories in the night before they're going for like a big bench PR, and they're wondering why they're getting crushed by 90% of their max. And I think that we can kind of put that whole conversation to the side, because at a point you do have to address those things. But assuming that they are addressed, the next biggest thing I see is just either A, too much sway in what they're doing, week to week, block to block. I was having a conversation with a close friend of mine who, they want to get back into powerlifting and they're kind of like looking at it and they're talking to me about coaching and stuff. And they're like, like I missed my set of sixes again this week. I'm going to do fives next week and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that to get through it. And I'm like, we need to look a little more globally at what's just going on within the week. What's your structure like and how are you changing it every week like this person seems to be. So too many changes at once takes away your ability to build that roadmap. It takes away your ability to figure out the way out of the maze. And then the other side of it is you keep going in a circle and you keep, making the same three turns and ending up back at the same spot. It's like, okay, well now how do we get out of that third turn? There has to be another path that you're not looking at. And oftentimes that's when the technique side of things starts to come in where you may be able to do 85-90% of your max on your bench single year round, but the actual way that you're moving that weight week to week or block to block fluctuates so much because you're not priming the movement correctly, or maybe you're not addressing some other weak point outside of there that would lead to that improvement in technical proficiency that would get you over that hump.
Yeah. I've got one lifter that we're prepping for Nats right now. I just made a post about him the other day, and his bench is up almost like 20 pounds in our first 3 months right now, which is great coming from somebody who's like squatting. We're closing on a 700-pound squat, right? But he's benching like low threes or mid threes, and like he just took 353 for a triple. And one of the big things I saw, like I got a pretty big headache, to be honest with you, when I was looking at his training logs, like legitimately a headache from like how cross-eyed I went looking at 8 weeks of training. It was like 6 different programs.
Yeah.
And that, hey, a lot of these very heavily periodized plans didn't just come out of thin air. Like they're typically built from the ground up around the athlete. And then you end up looking, when you're reading someone else's program or you read a Russian sports science book, you're seeing the end result of all that, of like, here's all the things we did and the little tweaks, but you end up majoring in the minors as opposed to having like a really reliable foundation to work from with training where, hey, if I do a program that's 90 or 95% similar every week, and like Monday I do bench, work up to like a max triple, and then Wednesday I do close grip and I work up to a set of 5 at like an 8 RPE, as an example here, right? And then Fridays I just do overhead presses, right? But I keep it to mostly sets of 10 and 12 because my shoulders get cranky if I push the load up enough to do like hard sets of 5.
Yep.
And then you do that every week and you can say, hey, every week I'm seeing a little bit of improvement here. You can stack those wins and you can create this momentum behind you as opposed to this like short burst of progress. And the more your weeks or training cycles, whether that's a week or you stretch it out to 2 weeks, the more that varies, the harder it is to pick out any trends in rate of gain, which I think is going to be the best place to look at identifying like what's going to work well for you, right? And just identifying like where's your starting max and where is it on the next week and the next week, and over the course of 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, how much does that come up? And then if you compare that to another program, well, did you come up 5% on one program and 7 on the other? Well, okay, let's look a little closer at the 7% program and see what's different and what's similar and start to fill in the blanks there. But I think if you can have the best rate of gain, that's probably the best place to start. And going back to that Chad example, like literally double the progress on one block versus the other. And the way that we were able to identify that and distill down, what's worked well for him, where we're looking at his first 500-pound squat, is real quick. If you're feeling overwhelmed by a lot of the possibilities for your training right now and are looking for some help with getting unstuck to find what the most productive training block for you will be to hit your next PR, you can just click the link down in the podcast notes. And what I'll do is I'll reach out directly. I'll go through for free with you your training logs and help you find that golden microcycle and what your likely most productive next training block will be. There's no cost associated with it, no catch. Just click the link. You can submit an application, and I can't necessarily guarantee that I'll be able to reach out instantly right away, but I will get back to you as soon as I see your submission and talk a little bit more with you to see how I can help you hit that next PR for free. Just having those repeatable weeks, and like we're going to take something very similar week over week to build on it.
Yeah.
What do you do when you might have somebody who's in that situation where maybe their program's are fairly static across a block. They're working with modern golden microcycle kind of theory, right?
Yeah.
And what was working stopped working. Where do you
Yeah.
start?
Yeah. So the first thing that I do whenever I've got someone, because I'm a big golden microcycle person, all my athletes know that. But one of the first things that I look at is how are you just feeling on a day to day basis, right? Because it could be something as simple as like squatting on Tuesday and Friday. And Friday, bar feels super heavy on the back, and you don't feel like your legs are working. So we just literally switch those days, and it's just the change of rate of exposure sometimes is the thing that makes you feel good underneath the bar, and then that gives you the energy to actually push through. But what's the ramification of that as well? Now is your deadlift going to tank a little bit, or are you going to feel super beat up for the rest of the week? Now we need to address that there's probably a difference between what you can physically do and what you can physically recover from. And that's where it becomes a lot of like getting the athlete to understand now, not necessarily looking at it on a week to week basis, but now I'm potentially looking at, what's your entire block going to look like? How are we going to get you from the start of the block to the end of the block with that new gap in mind? How are we going to address that? And beyond that, is that something that's going to rear its head at the end of the block where like you hit a 3 rep max and it's sub maximal, you hit like an RP7 or RP8, like new 3 rep max, but then you're tanked for the next 6 weeks. Now we have to look at it even further out and be like, okay, now we have to address it like on a bi-blockly or even like a whole like, macrocycle type of layout. But the first thing is just understanding what does the athlete feel on a day-to-day basis with the particular lift or with the lifts, plural, that are giving them issues. Do they feel the target tissue working? Do they feel some kind of like anxiety about the weight because they don't feel good underneath the bar? Or do they feel anxiety about the weight because it's like an extra plate is on the bar suddenly and there is a mental hurdle to be addressed there? But yeah, the first thing is just saying, what do you feel?
Yeah. Yeah. Getting that subjective experience, I think, is super valuable. I mean, as much as sometimes I would love to work with some machines and just be like, all right, input, output. It's a bit more complicated than that working with people. And that's okay. Like that's part of what makes it fun as well. But I feel like from there, I like to look back and just identify, what's changed as well in terms of the inputs recently, both at a training program level as well as like what are the externals looking like? Has there been any low-hanging fruit that's changed? Has your sleep been way off? Did you just have a baby? As I know a couple of lifters you work with have just had.
Hey, he hit a squat PR easily off of that. I'm thinking the more sleep deprived Johnny is, the better of a lifter he becomes.
Yeah, I mean, where's the floor? But hey, if proof is in the pudding. So I think right now we've got a good sample size and we tell him to keep having babies and it'll be good for his squat. But yeah, so like bringing it back to the example with Chad, for example, right? His squat had been pretty stagnant for a while. Like we were seeing a lot of stuff below the surface, like the odd rep PR here and there, technique was improving, but like at the end of the day, it had been long enough where like outcome wise, it wasn't what we wanted. And we could make arguments for like all the things that were like looking good on paper, but it just wasn't translating to like the same magnitude of change on his squat. Like we took a 2.5 kilo squat PR at his last meet when we were projected to go 5 or 7.5, right? And I was like, all right, well, we've probably got some room to improve here. We need to figure out how to make that sort of translate onto the top end, right? And I think that one of the best ways we can do that is, well, eventually you're just going to hit a point where you take your max sub-maximally. And so if I pull up my notes with Chad's block, so that block where he made double the progress, right? We had done some singles because he responded really well to those. But most of his work was at a fairly moderate amount of volume. Like I think we had maybe 6 hard sets a week across all of his squat variants. Mm-hmm. And his RPEs were capped pretty well around an 8, with the exception of one set of 5 at a 9 over the whole week. So we'd work up to like a top single at an 8, top 5 at a 9 on his squat, a couple of lighter back downs in that 7 to 8 RPE range. And then his pause squats we would do earlier in the week at an 8. And then we did basically the other half of his program was like sets of 10 to 12 on quad work at RPE 7, which I wouldn't exactly deem hard, but it was enough to keep the workload high enough for him that he didn't detrain without basically cooking him and killing all the momentum in the block. And so like on any given week, I do think we could have pushed harder. But what we saw over the block was like his projected max came up pretty routinely, 10 to 12 pounds every single week. Right? So if we're looking at that 2.5% increase every week over the course of a block, that starts to add up. And then we can start to ask this question of like, all right, well, if we're looking at old block reviews, do you want to make 15 pounds of progress this week? Or do you want to make 5 pounds of progress for the next 5 weeks?
Yeah.
And I feel like the answer gets very easy there as long as you can multiply by 5, which is I'm taking the 25 pounds.
Yeah,
Right?
and I think that that's the thing that a lot of lifters need to understand at times too. It's not just about the session that you're in right now. Like, oh, I can go for a 4 rep set, PR on bench any day I want to at this point, but it's gonna mess me up for the next 2.5 weeks if I just go off program and do that. Versus if I take the small 2.5 pound PR at the end of the block, I'm guaranteed to almost guaranteed to hit a bench PR at the end of the block as well. And it trends very similarly, and that's just keeping in the back of my mind is just not getting greedy at the time, pacing it, understanding kind of like what we talked about before. There could be very well a gap between what you can do and what you can recover from. And even if that gap doesn't necessarily exist, how much you can push at a given time is still going to be finite. And
Yeah.
being able to push a little bit more often is better than being able to push big one time.
Yeah, it's a pennies in the jar situation with training after the intermediate phase. Like you have to be able to just stack the micro wins and not focus on, especially if it's like a meet day, go for bust, right? But it's
Yeah, send it.
what 363 days a year. You're probably not at a meet. We're looking at multiples of like 182 or something like that times the potency there. Like we can definitely just work on small but consistent improvements and build that momentum. And so I feel like one of the things as well that I look at when I have a lifter who we're just seeing not that same rate of return, like we had a great block but we're not able to recreate it, is there's some lifters that just tend to go stale quite quickly, where it's not like the program is never going to work again, but it's more that they've been beating the same drum for too long, right? The well has run dry and it just needs a bit of time to refill. You got to go draw from some other well. And Chad is definitely one of those lifters. Like so his blocks are typically 5 weeks long or so. And I can get 5 great weeks out of him with like a really good training cycle. And then we can start the next block feeling like we're on top of the world if we take the same block structure, right? And it's like routinely, we're going to get to week 2 or week 3. And then we're just going to watch the rest of the block go south so hard. Like he gets so stale and it's over. And he's, I'd say, a fairly adaptive lifter in that sense of that we need to be able to vary it. And for clarity here, that block that we saw that really big rate of return on, that 7.5% gain, whatever it was, like he hit a new all-time squat PR in that block. He took I think it was a 2.5 pound squat PR at RPE 8. So he took his all-out max, added 2.5 pounds, and did it with like 2 in the tank, right? It was huge. And that's the block we're going to run going into our Summer Open this year, right? But we're going to make sure we have enough time away from that block to make sure that it has that same like hard-hitting potency that we saw the first time we tried it. And I think having that B structure as well, like that, hey, here's something that might not work quite as well, but it works pretty well and it sets me up for the layup so I can dunk, is one of the best tools you can have. Because if you can find 2 or even 3 different strategies that work well for you, you can take that programming and instead of progressing well, half the time or a third of the time and then just being on like reset mode for a while, you can progress on all these different areas and maybe you get 5% return on one block and you get 7 on the really good one. Well, we're averaging out at 6 per block instead of 3.5, right?
Yeah, I got something very similar with a female lifter of mine, Erin, who's actually competing this weekend. So She works construction. Her schedule is constantly rotating, constantly changing. And for her bench, we know like, hey, if she does like a heavy-ish set of three, 2 days before her primary day shows up super well. Past couple of weeks, because her schedule has been all over the place, she's been doing her secondary day on Wednesday, then the primary on like Sunday. So we just had to like creep in volume and creep in volume until it started to fill that gap. And now that she's competing on a Saturday, we're having her do her last session on Thursday, just doing a heavy set of three and then like a 4x3 back down at like weights she can throw at this point. And if we look at like historical trends, we know that like, hey, you're probably going to hit like a 5 to 10 pound PR. And then right after that, we're going to have to put you back in volume jail. Otherwise, you are going to push too hard too fast, or you're just going to show up flat over and over again. And she's another one who, like, we know that this works for a very short period of time, but after that, if she misses one bench, she just falls flat. Her shoulder starts to bother her, her elbow starts to bother her, and keeping her in volume jail helps bridge that gap for her.
Yeah. And I think it's nice to know, like, hey, when do you have the nitro? Like the nitrous that you can press the magic button and go faster in the car, right? But you can't just run on nitrous all the time. You blow the engine up. Shoulder starts to hurt, the lift flatlines, all of that stuff starts to creep back in. And so having those different avenues that you can progress on, I think is super important. Past, identifying what the blocks are that work really well, when I get into that sort of granularity in identifying like what are some of the themes and flavors and common elements between that, and the longer you've trained and the more notes you have, the easier this gets, right? Like I've been working with Chad for 12 years, so I have a lot of notes that I can go back on. And the notes from 12 years ago are not very relevant at this point, and that's okay. But the notes from earlier this year, the notes from last summer, those, I'm willing to put some weight into those. But I think if you can identify as your, like, what blocks do I pay attention to with, what blocks are the most productive in terms of how much I come up over the block, fantastic, right? That's your momentum metric. But then from there, if you go one level deeper, you can take a look at, okay, like what are some of the common RPEs that I'm seeing come up? What are some of the rep ranges or percentages I'm using?
Yeah.
Right? And then are there any exercises that are really productive as well? And if you can identify, okay, well, here's two blocks that showed me a pretty good rate of return. They both had Anderson squats, like for Chad they did. They both had Anderson squats in there. I'm probably going to have Anderson squats when I'm trying to use the nitrous button here, right? And similarly, I have another lifter where we've all but stripped out all the variation from her program. And I'm literally just like, all right, so your program is going to be low bar squats. And then on the other day, we're going to do low bar squats again, slightly differently. And I've named the block after her because she's the only person I go so specific with. Everyone else will just burn out on this approach. But for her, it's just like, she gets super beat up from doing all the other things. And I'm like, all right, well, let's just do that. Like, why fight this? Like, let's just squats and then fatigue you with some squats. And then you bounce back really well and you do really well in the squats. And she just took, what did she do? She went 96% of her max today for 6.
That's ridiculous.
Well, 96%, big quotation marks, right?
It doesn't matter. It's like the projected 1 rep max versus what you've actually done. There's always going to be that gap, and doing like, that would be like me taking like 620 for a set of 4 for a set of 6. Like, that's insane.
Yeah. And for reference, right? Like the last time she hit a set of 6 at her current 1 rep max, she had repped, I think, a little closer to like 87%, somewhere in there. So like we are, and we've always seen a very strong correlation. It's like when her 6s go up, her singles go up. That's like the number 1 lever we can pull.
Yeah.
Right. And like, we're just finishing this little golden block, and I'm going to have to go into some other stuff before we compete this summer, because like Chad, she is also incredibly adaptive. Like I don't even get 2 good weeks out of a block with her after the good ones. It's just sort of like, hey, we had a great block. I hope you're choosing to do something different, because otherwise I'm going to show you just how poorly I can perform. It gets messy really fast. And so basically just knowing like, hey, how many times in a row can I press this button before it falls off? Be a little bit preemptive on that. And then in building out those other themes, see how close you can stay to that really productive training without making the next time you hit the really good one go stale, basically, and sort of stealing from Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah. I mean, eventually you got to pay the piper, right? Like, golden microcycle will work for a very long time for some people. Like, I think I've made 3 changes to my structure in 3 years. But, we hit a wall, so we had to make another change. Um, and then you're going to spend a month or two just trying to regain footing at that point and understanding when to make that change. Like, perfect example, squat and deadlift. And I've had this happen with several of my lifters at this point where we would have be on an absolute tear with their squat, and then their deadlifts would fall off inevitably. And then we put the deadlift at the front of the week, and like the squat's now in the middle of the week somewhere, and now the deadlift is going up, and the squat is progressing just enough where I'm like, okay, so either next block we're gonna have a really good run with both, or deadlift is gonna continue to climb, and then we're gonna have to push squat further away, you know. And it's just a
And
matter
then
of
ultimately what you're doing there is you're zooming out, right? You're not looking at it on a weekly level. You're not like, oh, like squats are horrible this week. You're like, no, no, this block is just kind of focused more on prioritizing the deadlift, right?
yeah, exactly. And sometimes you give a lifter, like Elkino's a great example of this. His deadlift was not feeling great. We were doing, cluster singles and like a 3x3 back down. First set was like a percent drop. We switched it to RPE, and I said, you know what we're gonna do is you're squatting like 500 pounds. His max is 520. He's doing 500 like RPE 8. He's got another 30 to 40 pounds in him. I said, okay, you're going to be doing a deadlift competition in a couple weeks anyways. We're putting your deadlift at the front of the week. You're going to take the exact same numbers. It's just going to move better because you're not going to be beat up from your squat prior. And then we're going to just taper you super aggressively and just like see what happens. And so far, like knock on wood, everything's moving much faster. Everything's feeling much better. And that for him as a lifter is getting him out of his head quite a bit too, because he's very like neurotic. Like if it doesn't move a certain way, he's like, what could have possibly been wrong? It's like, bro, sometimes it just doesn't.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. And just like, here, there's a certain point where it just gets heavy and it'll feel bad. But like with those lifters who can be in their head, sometimes lean into that a bit. Be like, hey, we're going to set this lift up in a way where it's probably going to feel like the best lift you do all week.
Yeah.
And closer to a meet, let's lean into this peak performance idea and stack the chips in your favor a little more instead of trying to fight somebody's nature. That's stuff we can do in the long term if we need to.
Yeah, and that's a huge thing I've been seeing a lot lately with certain lifters. I'm not going to put names, but they're like, oh, like it didn't feel good today. It felt bad and blah blah blah, and like bar speed's fantastic. I'm like, okay, it felt shitty. But did it feel any more shitty than it normally feels? Because I can tell you it looks about as good as it normally looks, and there's 10 more pounds in the bar.
Yeah. Completely. Yeah, perfect. Okay. Anything you think we haven't covered in terms of block reviews, finding and putting together your best blocks and sort of how to reignite the progress you're making with stuff that was working before?
I think that the biggest thing that we didn't address is just like you need to leave some space, right? Even though we talked about how like you're basically building your map out of the maze and then trying to run it back, the maze could still change, and trying to take data, create a trend, and then force training to that trend, I think is just as dangerous as trying to completely revamp it every single month. Just because something led somewhere doesn't necessarily mean it will be super repeatable, especially if you wave load and you wave load aggressively, which I have a couple people who do that. I'm that way, but I'm very aware of like, hey, I have a finite amount of time that I can do this for. Like the block leading into a competition, I will wave load by 5 keys, knowing that is the only time I will be able to do that. After that, I'm going to need a pullback. And you can't just see the trend and imagine that that's going to be a line going out for the rest of your life. You may have times where you have to prioritize pushing harder, and times where you have to prioritize not pushing as hard, even if all the other things make sense and all the other indicators are there that this will be a golden block. It just may not be.
Yeah, and that really just boils down to that, like, humans are dynamic, variable creatures, right? And 2 is the amount you zoom out is going to have to vary, right? As a coach, I feel like one of our best strengths that we have is that we're objective, right? Like we are not the person lifting the weights. We have biases, but they're not the same feelings associated with being under the bar. and we're on the outside. So it's easier to zoom out and take a look at, okay, what do the numbers say? What do the trends say? How do you subjectively feel as the athlete, and start to compare those, and then look at that at a variety of time spans, right? So I might look at how did this week go and how do I want to move into next week, but also how does that fit within the month or the block? Yep. But also how does this block fit into our meet prep cycle over 3 months or 6 months, and progressively zoom out and zoom back in. And I think if you get trapped in any one of those time frames, you'll get stuck in that sort of fixed mindset of like you're going to try to force a progression or be like, this is what it's supposed to be. And you got to understand you're working with a live system here, right?
And to be clear, like that happens to everybody. I'll never forget, I came off of New Jersey States last year, the best meet I had to date, 500 dots, best lightweight lifter. And I was talking to somebody who goes to my gym who's also coached by Sean, and we were joking around. I'm like, oh no, I know exactly what I need to do for the next like 9 months to get an 800 kilo total. And like 3 weeks later, I blow my back out and I can't touch 400 pounds for like almost 6 months. Just like completely fucked the system, you know?
Yeah. I feel like I should create some sort of quote wall of like every lifter who's come off the best meet of their life and like how confident they are.
And then just like catastrophically injured themselves like 75% of their max.
Even if they don't, just like the sheer realization of like, oh yeah, okay, it's not predictable. Like even if it's just literally, yeah, no, like we gotta still adjust. Like I don't know exactly what's gonna happen over the next 6 months to the pound.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I feel like that's a really good place to leave things off here. That's a lot of detail, a lot of concepts, but ultimately, if you're going to look at the data, numbers are important. Look for the trends, but also address the fact that if you're doing things right in training, you're going to change over time. So don't try to square peg round hole this and force a system or progression into something that might not be working right now. Fantastic. Real quick, if you're feeling overwhelmed by a lot of the possibilities for your training right now and are looking for some help with getting unstuck to find what the most productive training block for you will be to hit your next PR, you can just click the link down in the podcast notes. And what I'll do is I'll reach out directly. I'll go through for free with you your training logs and help you find that golden microcycle and what your likely most productive next training block will be. There's no cost associated with it, no catch. Just click the link. You can submit an application, and I can't necessarily guarantee that I'll be able to reach out instantly right away, but I will get back to you as soon as I see your submission and talk a little bit more with you to see how I can help you hit that next PR for free.